Hello, everyone, and welcome to Church History 101. Thank you so much for joining us in this study. We hope and pray you and your families are well. We're happy to be back together again as we consider some of the things that have happened throughout church history and how we can have a better understanding of all that has been done to get us to where we are today. Obviously, Christianity looks very different from the times of Jesus Christ and the first, I won't say times of Jesus Christ, but I should say the earliest church times. And we need to, and I think we need to know why. And so one of the reasons why I started this is because I thought it would be interesting for us to go through a lot of the various changes and to see how Christianity has evolved over the years. And then ultimately try to determine what it means to really be a Christian, because obviously we all have our denominational preferences, our cultural preferences, our dogmatic preferences, and the question is, are any of these things true representations of Christianity as prescribed in the biblical text? And so we want to talk through that. Now, I also want to remind you that we will be moving to a different schedule going forward. We will be moving to a first and fourth Monday scenario. We want to use that time to go over these different things, and hopefully that will help bring some sort of clarity and time for us to process everything, and also research. And again, this is a very tedious process of studying so many different denominations. And I would also say that one of the complexities of studying history is that you have so many different things happening all over the world. And the duty of a historian, obviously, is to contextualize it all and present one big picture. And so that takes a lot of time. And I believe that's probably why the Bible is only concerned with one central thing rather than everything that happened in the world. We would never cover the Bible if it was written that way. So we're doing something unique in studying the entirety of church history. And I won't even say that. That's almost an impossible thing for us to do in a year. But we're covering a lot of information. And so we want to try to measure our discussions and then give time for process and further research and thinking, okay? So please note that in your calendar. Well, over the last few months, we have been talking about some of the more famous and well-known denominations within American Christianity. We talked about Lutheranism. We talked about the Baptists. We've talked about the Methodists. We've talked about Presbyterianism. In fact, we haven't talked about the Methodists yet, but we will get there. And the reason why we haven't talked about that is because the Methodists come after what we're going to talk about today. And so we'll have time to really get into that. But today what I want to talk to you about is the First Great Awakening, or many people call it the Great Awakening. And the reason I want to talk to you about that is because now we're entering into a period where we're starting to see the intersection of the Christian movements such as Baptist, Lutheranism, Methodism, Presbyterianism. We're starting to see these movements move further into American Methodism. And there's a reason for why that happened. Presbyterianism. One of the reasons why it happened is because of what we would like to call revival movements. And there's a reason for and really, revival movements have their origin, as far as we're concerned as Americans, and really over, especially within, and really the European part of the world, revivals have their origin in these awakenings, because there's something that happened. Let's kind of recap. If you think back to where we have revival, what we have studied so far, you have the Day of Pentecost, and then you have what we're going to study today. You think back to where we have revival, what we have studied so far. You have the Day of Pentecost, and then you have what we're going to study today. You think back to where we have revival, what we have.
All right, check one. All right, I don't know what's happening, guys, but I had to come in and fix this thing up here. So how are you all doing? Let's take a few minutes to greet each other. I don't know what's happening here, but I had to get everything straight. And we have some chaos here. Oh my goodness. My gosh. All right. Am I coming through clearly? Am I coming through with clarity here today? And let me know if things are a bit more normal. And if you are there, just give me something in the box to let me know you're here. And we'll just kind of pick up from where we started. All right. Hopefully everyone is doing well. Hopefully you are enjoying your Labor Day, I think it is. And hopefully I'm coming through a lot more clear now. All right, good. So let's get started. We're talking about the Great Awakening, and I apologize for the inconvenience, everything breaking up here and all of the things that have been going on here, but we're going to try to pick up from where we started and just try to give you a little bit of a snapshot on what happened with the Great Awakening. Obviously, there's a lot that we've been studying so far, and so I'll just kind of go through some of the things that we've studied in the past and just kind of get us through where we are now. So obviously, we've been studying church history for the last 9 months, and now we're at a point where we're breaking even further into the things that have happened throughout the history of the church. One of the things I want us to keep in mind and kind of be reminded of is the fact that the church history started with the Acts 2 occurrence, the Day of Pentecost. And obviously we're moving forward in a process that looks very different from what we have seen in what we've read in the biblical times. It's not necessarily wrong or bad, but it is something that we do need to consider and we need to take to note as we study church history and the things that we have and are experiencing today. So we have the Protestant movement that came to refute Roman Catholicism, which many people declare as one of the oldest institutions of Christianity. Protestantism creates this entire new movement of religious experience, from Lutheranism to Calvinism to Church of England to Baptist to Presbyterianism. We'll talk about the Methodists and all the other groups, but we see an evolution of Christianity. And we really can't really talk about American Christianity until we talk about tonight's topic, which is the Great Awakening and the things that happened during this time and the people that were involved in creating what we now know as revivalist movements. And so when you think about all the major revivals, Pentecostal revival, charismatic revival, Azusa Street revival, Methodism, all of these different revivals, I would argue have their origin in this Great Awakening, which really comes to indict the church in a way that we never saw before. And so we're going to talk about that. Now, a lot of scholars have argued about whether or not this revival was seen as a huge monumental event during the time that it was actually happening. A lot of people would argue that there was really no such thing as a great awakening during these actual times. Many people would not have said that this event is something that was very significant. In fact, there were a lot of different revivals happening throughout the European world and in the American colonies. And many people would have argued that it wasn't as much of a significant event as it is characterized to be today. It's kind of like when we look back on the life and times of Jesus Christ and we think about what was going on then, we idolize almost the apostles because we see them as such significant figures who did amazing things. But when you look at the biblical narrative and the attention that these individuals attracted, a lot of times this attention was negative. It wasn't something that they would have looked back on and said, oh, we're great heroes and everyone loves us and we're so phenomenal and impactful. Really, a lot of people looked at them and said, these people are crazy. These guys are out of their mind, and they're not people that we should be really concerned about because they're just foolish, common people, stirring a movement. But we look back on them and we observe the innovative way that they broke through history. And we recognize that they did things that were really, really, really powerful. And it merited great significance in the pages of history. And so we maximize the impact of the movement beyond what they would have imagined during their time. And many people declare that this is what happened with the Great Awakening. We look at the Great Awakening and we see that it is the first of its kind, and we make it the Great Awakening that we speak of today. Now, while many people may not have heralded the individuals that we will talk about tonight in the way that we do, they all do recognize the significance of the event. And so Thomas Kidd is an individual that we need to pay attention to, and we need to recognize, and we need to see, because he did a lot of research on this topic. And he said this. He stated that the Great Awakening was more than escalating conversations among a few theologians and historians. He goes on to say that there was indeed a powerful, unprecedented series of revivals from about 1740 to 1743 that touched many of the colonies, and that contemporaries remembered for decades as a special visitation of the Holy Spirit. And so there's a lot of things happening here, a lot of powerful things happening, that whenever you see it and whenever people observe it, they were able to say, we've never seen anything like this before. And so we want to at least give it that due respect before we dismiss it as this minor event that no one really paid attention to. Everyone knew that it was something significant, and they really embraced it as such. So let's talk about what was going on to spur this revival, to make this revival relevant. And I would argue that every revival has a contextual story. It has something that is going on in the world that petitions God's intervention. It is not so much a religious thing as it is a cultural or a geographical, or rather really a universal thing in many instances. There's something going on in the world, not just the church, that asks and requests for a revival. And this is the case in this revival. There was a new element of thinking, a new way of thinking that was kicking against the traditional mode of comprehending reality and the involvement of God and traditional religious practices. Many people during this time, they were brought up in Christian homes. They were brought up in homes that were dedicated to the Church of England. They were dedicated to God, a theistic God, the God that created and it is involved in the affairs of creation. These are all things that people presupposed. But now there was an age of enlightenment that had challenged those very foundational beliefs. And many people were skeptical of these ideas. So there were questions about God. There were more deistic modes of thinking. So people were not really believing in the God of the biblical narrative, the miraculous God that did these miracles and performed these great works and actually came into the world as a human being. All of these things were beginning to become questionable. And so the new age of enlightenment was being countered by what one author describes as a new age of faith, new answers for new questions and new oppositional thinking. And this is where this revival becomes very important, because what the revivalists begin to argue is that the lack of respect that is being paid to the traditional presuppositions of Christian thinking is creating an immoral and a unspiritual church. And if we are to be what God wants us to be, we need something that can connect to the heart and the mind. This is what one author said. About the times. It says a new age of faith arose to counter the currents of the age of enlightenment, to reaffirm the view that being truly religious meant trusting the heart rather than the head, prizing feeling more than thinking, and relying on biblical revelation rather than human reason. So you had the culture going more in the direction of human reason. What does the head say? Never mind the emotions or the feelings. Let's make this as logical and intellectual and as rational as possible. Whatever makes sense must be true. Whereas another group, which is now becoming the revivalist group, they're saying that we need to focus on what God is saying and doing to the heart. What is the feeling and the experience that we're having with God, and how do we express, or should we say explain ourselves through what we've experienced by God? It was two different ends of the spectrum. And this is very important. This is something that you want to, pay attention to, because you see those same sorts of distinctions in today's world. If you look at today's denominations, one is on the far right of experience, emotionalism, feeling, encounter, and another is on the other far left, which is what makes sense, what's intellectually stirring, what is comprehensive, rational. How can we make sense of this whole thing we call God, this whole experience we call God, should we say? And so you see those, and in the way to really tell the difference in the denominations that have these different modes of thinking is to determine which denominations were birthed after the revivalist movements. This one in particular, the ones that were birthed after the revivalist movement or the Great Awakening are normally offshoots of this revival. So you have like the Methodists, the Pentecostals, holiness, all of these experiential movements that prioritize an experience with the Spirit, versus Presbyterians, Lutherans, Church of England, even they're kind of a good balance maybe, but definitely Lutheranism and definitely Reformed, Presbyterian, even some of the Baptist movements tend to be more of an intellectually driven denomination than an experiential one. And so these are things that define these different movements based on what happened in this revival. Now, the individuals that were very significant in this revival was Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. They were not the only characters of the movement, but they were the primary drivers of the awakening. And Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield were some of the most brilliant people that this country has ever seen. Praise the Lord, everybody. Praise the Lord, Sister Burns. Praise the Lord, Mama. Praise the Lord, Aunt Jeanette, Sister Diane. Good to see y'all. Thank y'all for joining us tonight. They were brilliant, and we're going to talk about them extensively. But we should know also that they were not the only ones that this revival produced. In actuality, there were so many people in this revival that it wasn't really an individual personality that drove it. It was a culmination, a collaborative work of revivals across the American colonies that were really happening all over the place. And it happened over a span of about 3 years. And so we'll talk about the two significant figures tonight to help you understand what kind of preaching was going forth. All right. Now, Jonathan Edwards was a fascinating man. I mean, he was a brilliant man. He was a scholar and a philosopher. He was a theologian. He was a deep thinker. But what he understood was that God intended to reach the mind through the heart and not the other way around. Many people would say that God first attacks the mind and then engages the heart. But mostly what was happening during this time, God was so busy attacking the mind that he didn't have time to touch the heart. And because the heart wasn't being touched, the life of the individual wasn't being changed and wasn't creating any unique difference. And so what the revivalists would do, particularly Jonathan Edwards in this case, he would say, God has to connect with the heart. He wants to connect with the heart. And if he has to get to the mind, he will get to the mind through the heart. So his preaching was convicting. It was stirring. It was soul stirring. He was one of those hard, aggressive preachers, but at the same time, he was an intellectual. He was a brilliant man. He was a student. He would walk around with pads in his pocket, and he would write, and he would time out his day and allocate certain times for reading and studying and writing. Eating even was pinned into a schedule. He would write on the clothing that he had. And I mean, he was a thinker all the time, but he didn't allow his thinking to interrupt the interaction between God and his heart. And he felt like every person should have that. Now, this is what we know of him. He lived between a time of 1703 and 1758. So he died a fairly young man, which is common during this time. But he was recognized as the theologian philosopher, or the philosophical theologian, which is hard to be. It's hard to be both philosophical and theological, because the two worlds really even though theology comes from the school of philosophy, when you put the two together as far from a Judeo-Christian perspective, a lot of times theology refutes modern philosophy, especially the philosophy that was popular during this time. You had the sort of thought that just, in fact, philosophy sought to kick against the Judeo-Christian God. And so he was what we would call an apologist for the movement, because he was able to scholarly address the opposition that came from the academics concerning the revivalist movement, the Great Awakening. And so, being born and being a pastor in Northampton, Massachusetts, he was the one that was considered to be the starter of the Great Awakening, because it was believed that revival started in his father's church or grandfather's church back in 1728 and moving forward, more respectively, 1734. And so he's preaching there. He's stirring the crowd. People are really hearing what he has to say. And he's challenging the conscience of people during this time, making them understand that it's not just about what your head is perceiving, but it's about what your heart is moving towards. Now, the thing that's so interesting about him is that he was not only a great preacher, but he was a prolific writer. He would write these treatises, and he would defend the movement against those who were opposing. Now, you might say, well, why were they opposing this? Wouldn't everyone want to have, some sort of experience and some sort of revival in their city? Well, the criticism that they received was against the emotionalism of the revival. Back during these times, preachers would stand in front of the pulpit and read a manuscript and debate literally the oppositional thinking of the culture. They would challenge not only the opposition of the culture, but the dogma of other churches, deep theological dissertations about justification by faith and different Calvinistic arguments, and, whether a person is predestined or whether their soul is eternally secure. You would get literally a PhD dissertation every Sunday from a manuscript that they would read from, arguing the different theologies of men who have passed and have been determined as credible, thinkers. And, Jonathan Edwards and others would look and say, wait a minute, we're filling our head with information, but we're not filling our heart with God. And so he would, being the scholar that he was, he would oppose these different oppositions in the form of treaties. One of the more famous treaties that he wrote was Religious Affections, which was a defense of the Great Awakening. And it also criticized the other movements that were trying to counter the success of the Great Awakening. And you really need that. I think every movement needs a Jonathan Edwards. You need somebody that is able to put their ear to the ground and answer the opposition of the movement, because a lot of times what happens is we have these sort of experiences that we're not willing to defend or really articulate in a rational way. In other words, Jonathan Edwards was saying, what we are experiencing actually does make sense. And let me tell you why. All right. You need somebody like that. Now, what you don't want to get caught up in is these irrational experiences that have no biblical founding and no biblical root at all, and claim that it's God. He was not content with that. Again, remember, he was a scholar, a theologian, a philosopher, and we'll talk about a little later on just how much of a philosopher he really was. But he would go on to publish other books. One author stated that he was the principal intellectual interpreter of an apologist for the awakening. And that is important to note, because there are other preachers that are not as capable in this way as Jonathan Edwards was. You need this, okay? You need somebody that can be the voice to those who are too smart to be a part of a God movement, all right? So here he is. He's in Northampton, Massachusetts, and he's preaching. And in 1750, he got kicked out of his own church, all right? He was dismissed by a vote of 1 for his discipline of young people for reading immoral literature and for his refusal to give communion to unconverted church members. And so one thing about Jonathan Edwards, he was very firm. And the reason he was very firm is because he had two real principles in his theology. God is sovereign, fully in control, and God is holy. And he believed that the people of God should be a reflection of the holiness of God. He had this very, very, very stern rule that anybody who was not a converted church member could not participate in communion. Now you might say, why is that such a big deal? Well, in this particular time, people were trying to do whatever it took to get people into the church. And there was this sort of open door policy. There was this open door policy without any requirement to live in a sort of lifestyle that replicates, or should we say not replicate, but reflects the God that they were supposedly serving. And he was one of those preachers that said, you know what? No, we're not going to go with the any old thing. If you're going to be here, you need to make sure you're all the way here with God. And that's a tendency, a characteristic of the revivalist movement. You can see it in subsequent revivalist movements, Pentecostalism, Methodism, holiness movements, apostolic movements, all share these characteristics because we all are arguing that if we're having an experience with God, that experience should be transformative. It shouldn't be superficial. It shouldn't be abstract or just simply intellectual real estate in our head. It should be something that transform the believer into a new way of living. And so he took this very unpopular position and they said, man, you're out of here. Back in these days, you had to really earn your way into a pastorate. And if you didn't comply with the expectations of the church, they could get you out, kick you out. Well, one of the things about this time is that if you got kicked out of your church, you would go out and preach in the street. And that's exactly what he did. But more than that, his influence went beyond the church because, again, he was such an intellectual. He was a person that could study with the best of them. He could write with the best of them. He could think with the best of them. He was well equipped. And so what he ultimately did is he went on to supervise a boarding school for Indian boys, and he completed other theological writings, other theological works. One thing you want to check out by Jonathan Edwards is this sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And in that sermon, what he does, and it's almost as long as a dissertation, but what he does in that sermon is he dramatizes exactly what it would be like for a sinner to enter into the hands of God's wrath. And he is very dramatic. During the sermon, people were crying and weeping and wailing, and outbursts of tears were happening under the conviction of this preaching. And that's exactly what he wanted to happen. He wanted people to hear this sermon and be completely convicted and compelled to change their lifestyles. And so that's the sort of thing that he did. Another thing that this revival did is, as we mentioned earlier, is it went outside of the boundaries of the established demographic audience. It was a sort of abolitionist movement as well, advocating the liberation of vulnerable populations. They went to African Americans, and by no means were these individuals, by no means were they perfect in regard to their fight against slavery and discrimination. They had their share of problems, but they were at least open to the fact of going, open to the opportunity of going to other people outside of their own ethnic community. And that's a characteristic of this movement that distinguishes it from all other established and existing institutions. Now, many people consider Jonathan Edwards one of the most important, one of the most prolific, and one of the most essential American preachers of all time. And it's because of the path that he set. He really set and blazed a trail that will allow future theologians and pastors to come in and do the same sort of things. He ultimately ended his life as president of Princeton University. So you think about these major universities, Yale, which is a school that he attended, Princeton, you have other schools that we'll talk about later. All of these colleges and universities were influential in developing the educational culture of the early American colonies. And so you have a new country coming into existence. You have people like Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, early revivalists coming in and shaping not only the religious thought of the country, also the educational thought of the country, the cultural pulse of the country. All of this is important because we have a sort of framework that is built on the Judeo-Christian God that comes from somewhere. It comes not only from the Church of England's influence, but more so the revivalist movements that move from colony to colony. All right. So that's very important to know. Now let's talk about George Whitefield. Now, whereas Jonathan Edwards was the scholar pastor, he was the philosophical, theological teacher and preacher, George Whitefield was not as astute, or should we say as much of an intellect as Jonathan Edwards. But at the same time, Jonathan Edwards was not much of a theatric preacher as George Whitefield. George Whitefield was the guy that could hold your attention for 2 or 3 hours because he dramatized everything he preached. There's a story in a book that I was reading about these individuals. It's called Gospel Patriots, a very good book. And in the book, praise the Lord, Stephanie, good to see you. In the book, what he did is the book tells a story of how he went to this actress and said, you know, here we are as preachers preaching about real life events, and it seems as if our audience is just completely unengaged. They're unbothered, not even engaged in what we're saying. Meanwhile, you actors are acting out things that are completely unreal, yet you have the attention of your audience the entire time. And he asked the actor, why is it that the preacher cannot maintain the attention of the audience, whereas the actor can? And the actor responded to him, said, that's a simple thing. Here's my answer. The answer is that while the preacher talks about things that are completely real, he preaches it in a way that makes it seem as if it's unreal. Whereas the actor, while we are acting out things that are completely unreal, we are acting it in a way that makes it seem as if it is completely real. And from that day forward, George Whitefield decided that he would preach as though what he's preaching is real. And that meant preaching in dramatic form. And I mean, really, he preached all over the place. One's article stated that it is believed that he preached to over 80% of all American colonists, at least once. And he became a celebrity for it. Before there was ever a Billy Graham or Billy Sunday or TV ministry, you had George Whitefield, who was sort of the celebrity preacher. Another scholar had pointed out that he was his name was mentioned in the same breath of the elite and the royals of the day. So you might hear about the queen or the prince or the duke, but right there you would hear the name George Whitefield, which is something very abnormal. You don't hear common people being spoken of in the same breath as the royal, because first off, you wouldn't know a common person like that in this time. But George Whitefield had such a reputation that even the common people and the rich wanted to hear the preaching of George Whitefield. He was that attractive, that demanding, that, dramatic in his presentation. All right. So let's talk about George Whitefield. He was born in England and he traveled between England and America. So he had 2 dominant areas that he preached in. One of the things about him is, whereas Jonathan Edwards was, he was more of an academic, and he got kicked out of his church. And so he had to resort to being an academic for income and for occupational reasons. George Whitefield was sought out by everyone to preach. You had the royals calling him into their homes to preach to them, paying his way to do so. I mean, literally supporting his ministry financially to go from England to America. People believed in him in this way, and he was a charismatic figure. In 1738 is when he traveled to Georgia, which would be one of 7 trips to America. So you can just imagine the expense and the time that it would take to travel from England to America without boats, without cars, without the sort of innovative travel modes that we have today. Here's this man traveling across the water in this sort of time. And he would spend a year or so in America and return back to England in 1739. He would come back to Philadelphia. He would come to Boston, where it's believed he preached to 30,000 people, which at that time was more people than there were in the city of Boston at that time. So here he is preaching to populations that outnumbered cities at this time. And people were so attracted to him. Now, here's the thing. No church wanted him there because, again, revivals tend to refute and indict and oppose and contradict whatever is happening in churches. He didn't want to be there, and they didn't want him there. They kicked him out of it, in fact. And so what he did is he would literally go and he would preach in fields. And the stories that are told about him is his voice would project across fields. That's how strong and powerful of a voice, how eloquent and how distinguished his voice was, which was even more of a reason why people flocked to him. Now, if you look at the newspapers during these times, you'll see the heavy criticism of individuals like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, especially George Whitefield, because in a time when people were used to hearing what you would call, educationally charged, it was more like an intellectual dissertation. And I keep using that word because that's the way it's described. And what I want you to understand is not that they were saying one person is dumb and one person isn't. What they were saying is there's a way that we have established for processing information. We process our information through our head so that hopefully it reach our heart. And these men were doing something uniquely different. They were challenging, or should we say, challenging the hearts of men in hopes that it would reach their head. And many people thought that this sort of preaching was barbaric. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to be a part of a movement that would, have this sort of gyrating and moving and theatrical behaviors, because to them it was just unintelligent. Okay. And you have to understand England and early American colonization. If you could just step back in the time, you understand perfectly what kind of conflict this would have brought in the early colonies of America. But he didn't mind it. He didn't care. People loved it, and he went along with it. One writer says he was not acting as he preached so much as he was exhibiting a one-to-one correspondence between his inner passions and the biblical saints he embodied. So many people saw it as, acting, but he saw it as, I want you to see the characters that I'm preaching about. I want you to feel the moments that I'm describing to you. I want you to be in the presence of the encounters that we're describing through our preaching. And he acted it out. I mean, he would be moving, jumping, yelling, spinning. I mean, it was just an outright show. And I can't say that some of the elites would not have invited him there for a show, because perhaps that's exactly what they did. But others discerned the conviction of what he was doing. They saw that this man was completely engulfed by what he was preaching. And it was not only a demonstration, but an actual conviction that he was expressing. All right. So we mentioned earlier about his, how much he did not appreciate the established church. They didn't appreciate him. And one of the things that he did in his sermons that was typical is he spoke against the established church. He kind of reminds me, perhaps not as, because we don't hear of John the Baptist as being so theatrical, but we do hear of him being bold and unorthodox. And every now and then, my brothers and sisters, we need an unorthodox revival. We need something that will break the norm. We need something that won't look like what we always do. And we got a glimpse of that with the revivals that started with Rick Warren and some of the unchurched ministries that were targeting people who were not used to coming to church. So you had sort of like this coming to church in jeans, this sort of unplanned church scenario, very casual, very laid back. And some of the more traditionalists were looking like, that ain't church. All right. Churches, when we come and have our suits on, we hear the preacher preach, we have a choir, we have this very cathedral-like experience, and we go home. Meanwhile, they were reaching thousands and thousands of people that would never walk in our traditional services because they were doing something unorthodox. Listen, every generation will require an unorthodox revival in order to reach those people who have been completely turned off by the traditional presentation of religious experience. It happens throughout the Bible. It happens throughout church history. It never ceases to stop. The question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the next unorthodox revival? What is it going to look like? Will it be people watching church from home? All right. And not ever going back to a church. What is it going to look like? We have something. And remember, revivals are always a response to not religious problems, but natural problems, things that are happening in the world at large, not just things that are happening in the church. It is a response to things that are happening in the world at large that have not been responded to appropriately by the church. All right. Does that make sense? So like in this time, the thing that was happening at the world at large was that they were thinking differently about truth. The church didn't have a good enough answer for it. And so here you are, an unorthodox presentation and the response is given and people are flocking to it. And so you see this sort of thing happen. George Whitefield, he didn't mind being considered unorthodox. He actually welcomed it, and it was a part of his image, and he embraced it. Now, whereas Jonathan Edwards went to the Indian boys, George Whitefield went to the slaves, and he would encourage slave owners to acknowledge their slaves' spiritual freedom. Now, many critics today will say, while he recognized that they were supposed to be spiritually free, he did not preach an advocacy of their natural freedom. They argue that he should have went further and continued to preach against that natural and literal freedom from slave masters. For what it's worth, I agree that should have happened. Unfortunately, we don't always get the best out of each other that we could possibly get. But what we do want to say is that to say this during this time was completely against the grain. You would not hear anybody preaching this sort of thing because at the start of this country, slaves were not considered human beings. They were considered property, animals at best. And so to hear a man go and say, listen, you ought to recognize that these slaves are human beings and they are to be spiritually freed from sin as you are. You need to preach salvation to them because they have a rightful place in heaven just as much as you do. Listen, that was a big deal. And so it's something to be considered. Now, he would travel from Georgia to England back and forth, and he would have all these different individuals. He preached again as to the elite, people as high as the Queen, the political figures of England, Benjamin Franklin. They all knew of George Whitefield. Now, listen to this. This man preached, it is said, over 18,000 sermons in his lifetime. It is estimated that he would preach 2 sermons a day, at least 2 sermons a day, sometimes more. It's just an amazing amount of preaching that he did. They estimated that he would preach 40 to 50 hours a week in the pulpit. And he would wake up at 4 o'clock and be preaching by 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. That's how much this man preached. He preached himself to death, literally. He died in 1770 in Massachusetts. And he was a preaching man. He lived to preach. And he died being sick from preaching, literally. So this is something that we ought to think about as far as the activity, the way that these men thought. But let's talk about the impact that this awakening had on America. The revival that the Great Awakening was taking place during a time where church memberships were decreasing because people were becoming more skeptical. It sounds a lot about what sounds a lot like what we're experiencing now. The decrease in Christian attendance, the decrease in traditional belief, the decrease in conviction of traditional values, People just are not as invested any longer. And so that means we need some sort of revival that will respond appropriately to the skepticism of the current times. The Great Awakening did that for their time. And it is estimated that 350 churches were established as a result of the Great Awakening. And over 50,000 people joined these churches as a result of the Great Awakening. So you have this sort of refocusing, all right? Now we have an attraction to the church again from the Great Awakening, which is something that we can never overstate. Now, when you talk about the influence of the Great Awakening outside of the church, you want to think about the schools that were uniquely involved in this time, and particularly impacted through the Great Awakening. Princeton University, which is the college that Jonathan Edwards became the president over. Brown, Rutgers, all of these schools, which a lot of them are still around today. The schools we determined to be Ivy League schools are the ones that were around during these times and were impacted by the responses that this awakening gave the skeptics of the day. And so while it doesn't look like it a lot today, we don't think about the Great Awakening, when we think about Yale or Princeton or, all these other schools. We need to understand that they were around during these times, and their very foundations are shaped around the things that were happening through this revival. It is the conviction of truth, that truth does exist within a Judeo-Christian perspective, that formulated these schools. Many of them were responses. They were built to respond and equip the church with reasonable answers against the broader society. We'll never see that now, right? But that's what they were. In fact, they were all, these schools in particular, Rutgers, Brown, Princeton, they were all established to support the awakening and train clergymen who stood for the principles of the Great Awakening. So it was sort of a school for the laymen and the clergymen. Now, when we're thinking about the cultural impact, we ought to understand that what these men, particularly George Whitefield, preaching to such high and elite individuals, he had the ability to affect and really impact the way that those cultural movers, those ones who impacted the culture more than anyone else, he had a way of influencing them. He converted a lot of them, and he encouraged a lot of them to participate and support missionary work in the broader world. So the whole idea of missionaries that we see even to this day are things that were encouraged through Great Awakening, revivalist movements, because the idea became spreading the message as far and as wide as we possibly can, because the world is being taken over by such vulgar and such immoral and such unbiblical principles. It is our job to get out there and do something about it. Now, the elite weren't going to go traveling across the world, but what they would do is they would fund those who would. So you had patrons that would pay the way for individuals like George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, to go out there and preach to the unreached populations, which is something we're still doing today. And understand, this is uniquely done in the midst of a Calvinistic society that states God chooses who will be saved. So it's not really your business to waste your time trying to figure out, how you can reach people that he wants to get to. Really, it's God's business to get who he wants to get to. So there's no real big need for what we call missionary work. It is a challenge to the theological idea that God will only save who he wills. And it is now a mindset that says God wants to save as many people as he can. Now, John Wesley will really, really bring that out more than anybody. We'll see him talk about that. He will really step out on a different ground than even these individuals. But whereas Jonathan Edwards had more of a Calvinistic conviction, George Whitefield was out to get everybody he can, because in his mind, God wanted everybody to be saved. It is his job to get out and reach as many as he possibly can. And so here he is, he's influencing the elite to take their part in this endeavor. Lastly, the Great Awakening had a great impact on the citizens of New England and in America as well. Missions were started that were, what they would call dormant for years. They would go back and start these missions up, and it would really challenge the authoritarian institutions of America, and more specifically England. And the reason why this is important is because these revivalists gave the people license to challenge their preachers. They really did. They told them, listen, if your preachers are not giving you this conviction preaching, not showing you a better way, not giving you the opportunity to change and preaching a message that changes you, then you don't need to be as obligated to them. You need to first seek out God. And it was really the Protestant Reformation all over again. So you're seeing this sort of challenge and this sort of disagreement between the leaders and the people. People are questioning the leaders all the time, demanding an answer. And most times the answer that they gave either was not sufficient or they didn't get an answer at all. And so what would they do? They would turn away from their leaders and go to the revivalist preachers who were preaching somewhere in the field or in the streets, and they would be taken over by them. All of this sort of thing has influenced the way we practice Christianity in America today, from Baptist movements, which are now becoming more like these revivalist movements. Presbyterianism is greatly impacted by this. Apostolic, Holiness, Methodist, Pentecostal movements are, in my opinion, direct extensions from this movement into the modern age. And we're going to talk about that as we move further into our study. But it is worth saying that this movement set the landscape for American Christianity. And we'll see as we go forward just how much it shapes the American religious experience, which, by the way, is an attempt to separate from the Church of England and its authoritarian position. So it's worth saying that they did a good job in that regard, and they really started America off on the right foot. All right. Well, brothers and sisters, thank you so much for hanging with me. I hope you got something out of this. Again, I'm sorry for the delays and the interventions and the problems and all that happened early on. I hope you were able to get through all of that and get something out of this. But next week, or not next week, fourth Monday, we'll be back again. And we're going to study John and Charles Wesley, because they were somewhat contemporaries during this time. They were just as old, but they kind of came on the scene a little later. And we'll talk about their influence and their impact on the world and their methodological approach to Christianity, which is so powerful. And I think you will really enjoy a conversation about them. But until next time, you all be safe, take care, and we'll see you all next time. God bless.